Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can heal the deepest wounds in our hearts. In a world that often feels too busy and broken, one little girl's gentle spirit reminds us all of the magic that still exists around us. 8-year-old Emily. Parker lives in the farming town of Millbrook, where her grandmother fills her days with stories about the special bond between people and nature. While the grown-ups worry about their troubles, Emily spends her time exploring the fields and believing in wonder. One evening she finds a young deer tangled in barbed wire. The frightened animal is hurt and scared, but Emily carefully sets it free with her small, gentle hands. Then something amazing happens. Instead of running away like any wild deer should, this one stays. It looks at Emily with eyes that seem almost human, as if it knows something special about her heart. Word spreads through town, and people start to believe this deer carries a message of hope for everyone who has been carrying pain for too long. What could make a wild animal trust a human child so completely? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the fields of Millbrook in gentle gold, casting long shadows across farmland that had fed families for 3 generations. Emily Parker sat on her grandmother's porch, watching the light dance across the meadow, while her small fingers traced the delicate engravings on an old silver locket. The locket belonged to Grandmother Rose, who had worn it every day for as long as Emily could remember. Inside lay a pressed wildflower, its purple petals still holding traces of color despite the decades. "Tell me again about the flower, Grandma," Emily whispered, her voice soft as morning dew. Rose Parker settled into her rocking chair with the careful movements of someone who had lived 8 decades on this earth, her weathered hands still strong. From years of tending gardens and mending fences, reached out to gently touch Emily's dark hair. "That little violet was picked by my grandmother when she was about your age. She found it growing in the exact spot where she helped a wounded fox return to its den." Emily's eyes widened with the same wonder she felt each time she heard this story. "And the fox really came back to visit her?" "Every spring for 7 years," Rose confirmed, her voice carrying the weight of truth that only comes from stories passed down through generations. "Animals remember kindness, sweet child. They remember it in their hearts, just like we do." The farmhouse around them bore witness to countless such moments. Built in 1923 by Emily's great-grandfather, it stood as a testament to simpler times, when neighbors knew each other's names and children played until the fireflies came out. The wide front porch wrapped around 2 sides of the house, its wooden boards worn smooth by decades of bare feet and rocking chairs. Inside, the walls displayed photographs spanning 4 generations of Parkers, each face carrying that same gentle expression that seemed to run in the family like blue eyes or freckles. But Millbrook in the present day carried heavier burdens than the Millbrook of Rose's childhood stories. The economic downturn had hit farming communities especially hard, forcing many families to work multiple jobs just to keep their land. Emily's mother, Sarah, was no exception. At 32, she balanced her position at the county extension office with weekend shifts at Miller's hardware store, leaving Emily in Rose's capable care most afternoons and evenings. Sarah had learned to compartmentalize grief the way farmers learn to read weather patterns, out of necessity and survival. Emily's father had died in a car accident when she was only 4, leaving Sarah to navigate single motherhood while processing her own loss. She threw herself into practical matters, paying bills, maintaining their small house on the edge of town, ensuring Emily had everything she needed for school and activities. What she couldn't provide was the kind of unhurried attention that children crave, the luxury of long conversations about nothing and everything. That's where Rose stepped, in becoming Emily's bridge to wonder in a world that often felt too rushed and worried. Rose had moved in with them after Emily's father died, not because she needed care, but because she recognized that both Sarah and Emily needed her steady presence. She brought with her decades of stories, a vast knowledge of local plants and animals, and most importantly, the belief that magic still existed for those willing to see it. Their daily routine had developed naturally over the years. After school, Emily would walk the half-mile from Millbrook Elementary to her grandmother's house, her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders as she hurried down the gravel road lined with mailboxes and overgrown ditches. Rose would be waiting on the porch with a glass of cold milk and whatever cookies she'd baked that morning, always interested in hearing about Emily's day, but never pushy about it. The real adventures began after homework was finished. Rose would retrieve her leather-bound nature journal, its pages filled with pressed flowers, detailed sketches of birds and butterflies, and handwritten observations dating back 40 years. The journal itself was a work of art. Its brown leather, cover soft as velvet from handling, its brass clasp tarnished but still functional. Inside, Rose had documented not just the natural world around Millbrook, but the stories that connected her family to that world. "Look here," Rose would say, opening to a page filled with sketches of deer tracks. "This is from the winter your grandfather proposed to me. I was so flustered. I didn't notice I was following a doe's trail until she led me right to where he was waiting with the ring." Emily would run her finger along the careful pencil drawings, marveling at her grandmother's artistic skill. Each page revealed new stories, new connections between her family and the creatures that shared their land. There were sketches of the barn owl that nested in their loft every spring, detailed drawings of the fox family that denned near Miller's Creek, even pressed leaves from the oak tree where Emily's great-grandmother used to sit and watch for her. Husband's return from the fields. The supporting characters in Emily's daily life reflected the close-knit nature of small-town living, where everyone's business was known and discussed, but with the kind of caring familiarity that comes from shared struggles and celebrations. Mr. Harold Thompson lived in the house directly across from Emily's family, a 70-year-old retired farmer whose gruff exterior masked a heart still. Tender from losing his wife the previous spring, Harold had built his life around routine and skepticism, finding comfort in the predictable rhythms of tending his vegetable garden and maintaining his property. He viewed Rose's stories about animal connections with the kind of polite dismissal reserved for topics he considered fanciful. Yet he couldn't help but notice how Emily seemed to move through the world with an unusual awareness of the creatures around her. When other children would run shrieking from a spider or beetle, Emily would carefully observe it before gently relocating it to safety. Mrs. Lucy Chen served as Millbrook's head librarian, a position she'd held for 15 years after moving to town following her retirement from teaching in the city. Her small library occupied the bottom floor of what had once been the town's bank, its high ceilings and tall windows creating a sanctuary for books and quiet conversation. Lucy had recognized Emily's hunger for stories about animals and nature, carefully curating selections that fed her imagination while respecting Rose's role as her primary storyteller. The library became Emily's second home during the summer months, where she would spread picture books across the small reading table. In the children's section, lost in tales of brave animals and magical connections between humans and nature, Lucy would watch from her desk, noting how Emily's face would light up when she discovered a new story about healing or friendship between different species. But beneath the surface of Millbrook's seemingly peaceful existence lay currents of sadness and disconnection that the adults carried like stones in their pockets. The farming community had endured a series of losses over the past few years that had left people feeling isolated and guarded. 3 farms had been foreclosed, forcing families who had worked the same land for generations to start over in unfamiliar places. The town's only manufacturing plant had closed, taking 43 jobs with it. Most devastating of all, a school bus accident the previous winter had claimed the life of 10-year-old Marcus Webb, leaving the entire community to process grief. That felt too large for such a small place. These losses had created an atmosphere where survival took precedence over connection, where people focused on getting through each day rather than looking for meaning or beauty in their surroundings. Adults hurried past the very meadows and woodlands that had once provided their children with endless entertainment, too preoccupied with worry to notice the changing seasons or the wildlife that moved through their community like threads in a tapestry. Emily moved through this adult world of concern and distraction like a small beacon of attention and presence. While her mother rushed between jobs and her neighbors focused on their problems, Emily maintained the kind of awareness that comes naturally to children who haven't yet learned to ignore the world around them. She noticed which birds sang at different times of day, which flowers bloomed in succession throughout the spring, which trees the squirrels preferred for their nests. Most remarkably, she noticed the animals themselves in ways that seemed to transcend normal observation. When the barn cats at Peterson's farm had kittens, Emily seemed to sense which ones were ill before anyone else could tell. When old Murphy, the Henderson's border collie, was struggling with arthritis, Emily would sit beside him during her walks, somehow knowing exactly how to stroke his graying muzzle to bring him comfort. Rose watched these interactions with growing recognition that Emily had inherited something precious, the ability to bridge the gap between human and animal understanding that had run in their family for generations. She began to share deeper stories, ones she had never told Sarah, about her own grandmother's reputation as someone who could speak with the creatures of field and forest. Your great-great-grandmother Elena was known throughout 3 counties. Rose would tell Emily as they sat together on the porch in the growing dusk. People would bring her injured animals, lost animals, animals that seemed sick for no reason that the veterinarians could identify. She had a way of understanding what they needed, what they were trying to say. Emily would listen with rapt attention, sensing that these stories were more than entertainment. They were preparation for something she didn't yet understand, but felt approaching like distant thunder. The silver locket seemed to warm against her chest as Rose spoke, as if the pressed violet inside was responding to tales of its origins. As spring deepened into early summer, Emily found herself drawn more and more to the fields and meadows that surrounded Millbrook. Her after-school walks with Rose grew longer, extending past the familiar boundaries of town into areas where wildflowers grew in abundance and deer tracks marked the soft earth near Miller's Creek. She would walk slightly ahead of her grandmother, her young eyes scanning the landscape with increasing intensity, as if searching for something she couldn't yet name. The townspeople who encountered them on these walks began to notice Emily's unusual behavior around animals. She would freeze mid-step when a hawk circled overhead, watching its flight pattern with focused attention. She would detour from their planned route to investigate rustling in the underbrush, often discovering rabbits or squirrels that would regard her with curiosity rather than fear before going about their business. "That child has something special about her," Mrs. Chen would comment to other library patrons. "The way animals respond to her, it's almost like they know she understands them." Harold Thompson, despite his skepticism about Rose's stories, found himself watching Emily's interactions with the wildlife that visited his garden. The rabbits that usually fled at his approach would continue feeding when Emily was present. The cardinals that nested in his apple tree would sing more actively when she walked by, as if performing for an appreciative audience. Sarah began to notice changes in Emily as well, subtle shifts that might have escaped a less attentive mother's notice. Emily's drawings, which had always featured animals, became more detailed and expressive. The creatures she sketched seemed to have personality and emotion, their eyes conveying a depth that seemed remarkable for an 8-year-old's artwork. Her questions about her deceased father increasingly focused on his relationship with the natural world, seeking connections that might explain her own feelings of kinship with the animals around her. "Did Daddy like animals the way I do?" Emily asked one evening as Sarah tucked her into bed. Sarah paused in smoothing the quilt her own mother had made, considering how to answer truthfully without diminishing Emily's connection to her father's. "Memory. Your daddy appreciated all living things," she said carefully. "He used to say that people who were kind to animals usually had the biggest hearts." These conversations left Sarah with a mixture of pride and concern. She recognized that Emily's sensitivity was a gift, but she also worried about protecting that gift in a world that didn't always value gentleness. The practical demands of their life, school schedules, work commitments, household responsibilities, sometimes felt at odds with the unhurried pace that Emily's nature seemed to require. As the days grew longer and warmer, Rose began to sense that something significant was approaching. Her joints, usually reliable predictors of weather changes, felt different, not painful, but expectant, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. She found herself telling Emily stories she hadn't shared in years, tales passed down from her own grandmother about times when the boundary between human and animal understanding was thinner, more permeable. The leather journal began to feature new entries, Rose's careful handwriting documenting Emily's growing sensitivity and the increasing frequency of unusual animal encounters during their walks. She pressed fresh flowers between the pages, each one marking a day when Emily had demonstrated some new aspect of her developing gift. The stage was set in Millbrook for something extraordinary to unfold, though none of them, not Rose with her. Family stories, not Sarah with her protective love, not Emily with her growing awareness, could have predicted exactly what form that extraordinary event would take. The town itself seemed to be waiting, its fields and meadows and woodlands holding secrets that were about to be revealed through the gentle courage of one small girl whose heart was large enough to bridge the gap between human and animal understanding. The silver locket continued to rest against Emily's chest, its pressed violet a tangible link to generations of women who had understood that kindness toward all living creatures was not just a virtue, but a responsibility passed down through blood and story, waiting for the right moment to bloom into something that would touch not just one family, but an entire community hungry for healing and wonder. The evening air carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of Mr. Peterson's cattle settling in for the night when Emily discovered something that would change everything. She had been walking alone along the fence line that separated the Parker property from the unused pasture beyond, following a path worn smooth by generations of feet, both human and animal. Rose was resting on the porch after their earlier walk, and Sarah wouldn't be home from her Saturday shift at Miller's Hardware for another hour. Emily often treasured these moments of solitude when she could move through the familiar landscape. Without the need for conversation or explanation, the setting sun painted the world in shades of amber and rose, creating the kind of light that made everything seem touched by magic. She was humming softly to herself, a melody her grandmother had taught her when she heard it, a sound that made her young heart clench with recognition. It was the sound of fear and pain combined, a soft bleating that seemed to come from the direction of the old barbed wire fence that had stood neglected for years. The Hendersons had put it up decades ago to contain livestock they no longer kept, and time had made it more hazard than barrier. Several of the fence posts leaned at dangerous angles, and the wire itself had begun to sag and tangle in places. Where weather and neglect had taken their toll, Emily approached carefully, her small feet making no sound on the soft grass. What she found made her breath catch in her throat. A young fawn, probably no more than a few months old, had somehow become entangled in a section where the barbed wire had twisted into a cruel knot. The more the frightened animal had struggled, the more tightly the wire had wrapped around its slender leg, and now it lay exhausted and trembling, its large brown eyes wide with terror and pain. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, girl and deer simply looked at each other. Emily felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than thought or decision. This creature needed her help, and somehow she knew, with the same certainty she felt about the sunrise or the changing of seasons, that she was meant to be here at this exact moment. "Shh," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening breeze. "I'm going to help you." She knelt in the grass beside the trapped fawn, noting how its breathing came in quick, shallow pants, and how one delicate leg was held at an awkward angle by the twisted wire. The barbs had already drawn thin lines of blood where they pressed against the animal's spotted coat, but Emily could see that the injuries weren't deep. Not yet. Working with a patience that seemed remarkable for someone her age, Emily began the delicate process of untangling the wire. Her small fingers, more nimble than an adult's might have been, found their way into the twisted metal, carefully loosening each loop while murmuring soft reassurances to the frightened deer. The animal watched her with eyes that seemed almost human in their intelligence, as if it understood that this small person meant no harm. "That's it," Emily breathed, as she worked a particularly stubborn section free. "Almost there. You're going to be okay." The process took nearly 20 minutes, during which the fawn never once tried to kick or bite, despite its obvious fear. Instead, it seemed to grow calmer as Emily worked, its breathing slowing to a more normal rhythm as it sensed her gentle intentions. When the last twist of wire finally came free, Emily sat back on her heels, expecting the deer to leap up and bound away into the safety of the gathering dusk. But the fawn didn't run. Instead, it slowly struggled to its feet, testing the injured leg gingerly before taking a few careful steps. Then, in a moment that would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come, the young deer turned to face Emily directly. It took 3 deliberate steps toward her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of its breath, and gently touched its wet nose to her outstretched hand. Emily felt a jolt of connection, so profound it took her breath away. For just an instant, she could sense what the deer was feeling, not just gratitude, but a deep recognition, as if the animal knew something about her that she was only beginning to understand herself. The fawn's eyes, large and dark and impossibly expressive, seemed to look right into her soul. Then, with movement as graceful as water flowing downhill, the deer lowered its head in what could only be described as a bow. It held the position for several heartbeats before raising its head to look at Emily one more time. Only then did it turn and walk, not run but walk, toward the tree line, pausing once to look back before disappearing into the shadows. Emily remained kneeling in the grass for a long time after the deer vanished, her hand still extended, trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of her mind, the part that had been shaped by 8 years of living in the practical world, insisted that wild animals didn't bow to humans. They certainly didn't approach strangers or touch them voluntarily, but the deeper part of her, the part that had always felt connected to the natural world around her, knew that something extraordinary had just occurred. She was still sitting there, lost in thought, when she heard her name being called. Sarah's voice carried across the field, tinged with the kind of concern that comes when a parent realizes their child isn't where they're supposed to be. "Emily, where are you, sweetheart?" "I'm here, Mom," Emily called back, finally getting to her feet. She brushed the grass stains from her jeans and started walking toward the house, where she could see Sarah standing on the porch beside Rose. But with each step, she found herself glancing back toward the spot where the fence line met the woods, half expecting to see brown eyes watching her from the shadows. Sarah met her halfway across the field, relief evident in her expression. "What were you doing out here so late? Grandma said you went for a walk, but it's almost dark." Emily looked up at her mother, then at Rose, who had followed more slowly, and tried to find words for what had just happened. "There was a deer," she began carefully, "a baby deer caught in the old fence." Both women's expressions shifted to immediate concern. "Oh, honey," Sarah said, dropping to one knee to examine Emily for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did it kick you?" "No, Mom. I helped it get free." Emily's voice carried a quiet certainty that made both women pause. "It was scared, but it let me help it, and then She hesitated, knowing how strange it would sound. And then it said, "Thank you." Sarah frowned, glancing at Rose over Emily's head. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Animals can't really—" "It bowed to me," Emily interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "It touched my hand with its nose, and then it bowed like people do in a church sometimes, and I could feel—" She paused again, searching for words to describe something that felt beyond language. "I could feel what it was feeling. It was grateful, but it was more than that. It was like it knew me." Rose had been listening with an expression that grew more thoughtful with each word Emily spoke. Now she stepped closer, her weathered hand reaching out to gently touch Emily's shoulder. "Show us," she said quietly. They walked together to the fence line, where the twisted barbed wire still lay in the grass where Emily had dropped it. Small drops of blood on the metal confirmed that an animal had indeed been injured here, and the flattened grass showed where something had lain for an extended period. But it was the way the wire had been untangled that made Sarah catch her breath, each piece laid out carefully, methodically, as if someone had taken great care not to create additional hazards. "Emily," Sarah said slowly, "this wire is really tangled. How did you manage to get it apart without cutting yourself?" Emily looked down at her hands, surprised to realize they showed no scratches despite her lengthy work with the barbed wire. "I was just careful," she said simply. "I had to be careful because it was scared." Rose knelt down to examine the twisted metal, her experienced eyes taking in details that told a story of patience and skill that seemed beyond what an 8-year-old should possess. She had helped free trapped animals herself over the years, and she knew how difficult it could be, even with proper tools and adult strength. As they walked back toward the house, Rose fell into step beside Emily, while Sarah moved ahead to start dinner preparations. "Tell me more about how the deer looked at you," Rose said quietly. Emily considered the question carefully, sensing that her grandmother was asking for more than a simple description. "It looked at me like it knew who I was," she said finally. "Like maybe its mother had told it about me, or its grandmother, or somebody, like it had been waiting for me to find it." Rose felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. The pressed violet in her locket seemed to pulse against her chest, as if responding to Emily's words. "And how did that make you feel?" she asked. "Like I was exactly where I was supposed to be," Emily answered without hesitation. "Like everything that happened before was just getting me ready for that moment." That night, long after Emily had gone to bed, Rose sat on the porch with her nature journal open on her lap, trying to find words to describe what her granddaughter had experienced. The old barbed wire fence post stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and she found herself thinking about family stories that went back generations, tales of women who could bridge the gap between human and animal understanding. The pressed violet in her locket seemed to whisper of promises made and kept, of connections that ran deeper than blood or bone. Something had awakened in Emily tonight, something that Rose had been waiting her entire life to witness. And as she finally closed the journal and prepared for sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that the young deer would be back, and that this was only the beginning of a story that would touch not just their family, but their entire community. The barbed wire fence post would become something of a landmark in the days that followed, though no one quite understood why they felt drawn to notice it as they passed. It stood there like a silent witness to the moment when the extraordinary had touched the ordinary world of Millbrook, marking the place where a little girl's act of kindness had opened a door that could never quite be closed again. Emily woke the next morning with the strange sensation that the world had shifted overnight, like furniture rearranged in a familiar room. She lay in her bed, listening to the usual sounds of a Sunday morning in Millbrook, the distant lowing of cattle, the whistle of a cardinal outside her window, the gentle murmur of voices from the kitchen where her mother and grandmother were preparing breakfast. But underneath these familiar sounds, she heard something new, a soft rustling in the bushes beneath her bedroom window. She slipped out of bed and padded to the window, pulling aside the thin curtains her mother had sewn from fabric printed with tiny daisies. There, standing in the morning sunlight that filtered through the apple tree, was the fawn from the previous evening. It stood perfectly still, its spotted coat dappled with shadows, looking directly up at her window as if it had been waiting for her to appear. Their eyes met through the glass, and Emily felt again that peculiar sense of recognition, as if they were old friends reunited after a long separation. The deer's injured leg seemed to be healing well. It bore weight normally, and showed no signs of the previous evening's distress. But it was the way the animal held itself, alert but unafraid, curious but patient, that told Emily this was no ordinary wild creature. She dressed quickly and quietly, not wanting to disturb her family's Sunday morning routine with explanations. She wasn't sure she could adequately provide. As she tiptoed through the kitchen, Rose looked up from the pancake batter she was mixing. "Going to check on your friend?" Rose asked with a knowing smile that suggested she had perhaps looked out her own window that morning. Emily nodded, grateful that her grandmother seemed to understand without requiring lengthy explanations. "I'll be back for breakfast. Take your time, dear one. Some conversations can't be rushed." Outside, the morning air held that particular freshness that comes after a night of gentle rain, though Emily couldn't remember hearing any during the night. The grass felt cool and slightly damp under her bare feet as she approached the spot where the fawn waited beneath the apple tree. The animal watched her approach with calm interest, neither retreating nor advancing, maintaining a respectful distance that somehow felt like perfect etiquette. Emily sat down in the grass about 6 feet away, close enough for easy communication, but far enough to honor the deer's wild nature. They regarded each other in comfortable silence for several minutes, and Emily found herself thinking about the stories her grandmother had shared about animals that remembered kindness. This felt like more than memory, though. It felt like the beginning of a friendship. As if responding to her thoughts, the fawn took 2 careful steps closer, then settled gracefully into the grass, folding its legs beneath its body in the way deer do when they feel completely safe. Emily remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as the animal made itself comfortable in her presence. It was during this quiet communion that Emily first noticed the willow branch crown. It lay in the grass between them, woven from slender green branches in a pattern so intricate and delicate that it seemed more like artwork than accident. The branches had been bent and twisted with obvious intention, creating a circlet that would fit perfectly on a child's head. Morning dewdrops clung to the leaves, making the crown sparkle like it was decorated with tiny diamonds. Emily stared at the crown for a long moment, certain it hadn't been there when she first sat down. She looked around the yard, searching for an explanation. The nearest willow tree grew by Miller's Creek, almost a quarter-mile away. No human could have made this and placed it here without her noticing, yet the craftsmanship was too deliberate to be the work of wind or chance. The fawn seemed to be watching her reaction with interest, its head tilted slightly as if waiting to see what she would do. Slowly, carefully, Emily reached for the crown. The moment her fingers touched the woven branches, she felt a warmth spread up her arms and settle in her chest, similar to what she had experienced the previous evening. But gentler, more welcoming. She lifted the crown and examined it more closely. The branches had been woven together so skillfully that no ends stuck out, creating a perfect circle that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Small wildflowers had been threaded through the weaving, violets like the one in her grandmother's locket, tiny white flowers she didn't recognize, and delicate yellow blooms that smelled of honey when she brought them close to her nose. Acting on an impulse she didn't fully understand, Emily placed the crown on her head. It fit perfectly, settling against her dark hair as if it had been made specifically for her. The moment it touched her head, the world around her seemed to sharpen and brighten. She could hear individual bird songs with startling clarity, could smell the distinct scents of different flowers and grasses, could sense the movement of small creatures through the undergrowth in ways she never had before. Most remarkably, she could sense the fawn's emotions with perfect clarity. The animal radiated contentment and approval, along with something else, a deep satisfaction, as if Emily had just completed some important test or ceremony. The deer rose gracefully to its feet and approached her, close enough this time to gently nuzzle her hand. Through that touch, Emily felt a flood of wordless communication. Images flashed through her mind. The deer running through moonlit meadows, other woodland creatures gathering in hidden clearings, and most powerfully, a sense of belonging to something larger than herself, something ancient and protective that connected all living things. When the connection faded, Emily found herself sitting in her grandmother's garden with tears of joy streaming down her cheeks, though she couldn't have said exactly why she was crying. The fawn stepped back, but remained close, watching her with eyes that seemed infinitely wise for such a young creature. "Emily?" Sarah's voice called from the kitchen door. "Breakfast is ready, sweetheart." Emily looked toward the house, then back at the fawn, wondering how to explain what had just happened. But the deer seemed to understand her dilemma. It touched her hand once more with its wet nose, then turned and walked calmly toward the tree line, pausing at the edge of the yard to look back. Emily had the distinct impression it was saying goodbye for now, but not forever. She stood up, the willow crown still circling her head, and walked toward the house where she could see her mother and grandmother silhouetted in the doorway. Both women were staring at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Surprise mixed with something deeper, more complex. "Where did you get that beautiful crown?" Sarah asked as Emily approached. Emily touched the woven branches gently. "I found it in the grass. I think someone left it for me." Rose stepped closer, her eyes taking in every detail of the intricate weaving. "May I see it, dear?" Emily carefully removed the crown and handed it to her grandmother, who examined it with the kind of attention she usually reserved for pressed flowers or bird sketches. Rose's fingers traced the woven pattern, pausing at the places where the tiny wildflowers had been threaded through. "This is willow," Rose said quietly, "from trees that only grow near running water. And these flowers—" She touched one of the small white blooms. "I haven't seen these since I was a child. My grandmother used to call them friendship flowers because they only bloomed where different types of plants grew together in harmony." Sarah frowned, looking from the crown to Emily and back again. "Honey, are you sure you just found this? It looks like something that would take hours to make." Emily nodded, sensing that it had appeared between her and the fawn, as if placed there by invisible hands, might be too much for her mother to accept right now. "It was in the grass when I sat down with the deer. The deer came back." Sarah's voice carried a mixture of concern and fascination. "It's not afraid of me," Emily said simply. "I think it wants to be friends." Rose handed the crown back to Emily with careful reverence. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "that friendship might be exactly what it has in mind. But this kind of friendship comes with responsibilities, Emily. Are you ready for that?" Emily placed the crown back on her head, feeling again that sense of belonging and purpose. "I think so, Grandma. I think I was born ready." As they went inside for breakfast, none of them noticed Mr. Thompson watching from his kitchen window across the street, his coffee mug forgotten in his hands as he stared at the spot where Emily had been sitting. He had seen the entire interaction, though he wasn't sure he believed what his eyes had told him. Wild deer simply didn't behave that way, and crowns didn't appear from nowhere. But Harold Thompson had lived long enough to know that some things didn't need to make sense to be true, and what he had just witnessed felt more real than most of the sensible things that filled his days. He found himself thinking about his late wife Martha, who had always insisted that the natural world held more mystery than most people were willing to acknowledge. Maybe, he thought, as he watched Emily disappear into her house with that impossible crown still circling her dark hair, Maybe Martha had been right about more things than he had given her credit for. The days that followed Emily's discovery of the willow crown took on a rhythm that felt both natural and miraculous. Each morning, she would find the fawn waiting somewhere on their property, sometimes beneath the apple tree, sometimes near. The garden gate, once memorably standing in the middle of the gravel driveway, as if it had been patiently waiting for the family to wake up. The deer had become such a regular presence that Sarah began setting her alarm 15 minutes earlier, just to watch from the kitchen window as Emily conducted her morning conversations with their unusual visitor. It was during one of these morning encounters, exactly a week after the crown appeared, that Emily first spoke the name that seemed to arrive in her mind fully formed, as if it had been waiting there all along. "Good morning, Grace," she said, as she approached the fawn who was standing near Rose's herb garden, delicately avoiding the basil plants while investigating the scent of lavender. The name felt absolutely right the moment it left her lips. The deer's head lifted at the sound, and Emily could have sworn she saw recognition and approval in those large brown eyes. Grace. It was the name of her late grandfather's favorite hymn, the one Rose still hummed when she worked in her garden. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Emily could hear her grandmother's voice singing the familiar words, and somehow she knew this was exactly what the deer was meant to be called. That same morning brought the first sign that Emily and Grace's friendship was beginning to attract attention beyond their immediate family. A sleek black sedan pulled into their driveway just as Emily was saying goodbye to Grace before school, and a woman in a business suit emerged with a professional camera and a notepad that suggested reporter written all over her. "Hello there," the woman called out with the kind of forced cheerfulness that immediately put Emily on guard. "I'm Jessica Mills from Channel 7 News. I've heard there's a very special little girl here who's made friends with a wild deer. Would you like to be on television?" Emily instinctively stepped closer to Grace, who had frozen at the approach of this stranger. Through their growing connection, Emily could sense the deer's discomfort. Not fear exactly, but a wariness that made Emily's own protective instincts flare. "I don't think Grace wants to be on television," Emily said politely but firmly. "Grace!" The reporter's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that comes from discovering a detail that will make a story more compelling. "You've named the deer!" "How adorable! This is exactly the kind of heartwarming story our viewers love." But before the conversation could continue further, Rose appeared on the porch with the kind of presence that could stop conversations in their tracks. She moved with deliberate dignity, her weathered hands folded in front of her, her silver hair catching the morning light. "I'm afraid Emily needs to get ready for school," Rose said in a voice that brooked no argument, "and our family prefers to keep our private moments private." The reporter tried several more approaches, offering everything from a small payment to the promise of making Emily famous throughout the county. But Rose remained immovable. Eventually, Jessica Mills returned to her car, though not before, taking several photographs of Emily and Grace from a distance. After the reporter left, Rose sat on the porch steps beside Emily, both of them watching Grace graze peacefully in the morning sunlight. "Grandma," Emily said quietly, "why did that lady want to put me on television?" Rose considered her answer carefully. "Some people think that beautiful things need to be shared with the whole world to have value, but the most precious things, real, friendship, trust, love, these things are often too delicate for bright lights and cameras." Emily nodded, understanding intuitively what her grandmother meant. Her friendship with Grace felt sacred in a way that had nothing to do with publicity or attention. It was private and perfect just as it was. That afternoon brought more troubling news. Rose had been resting in her bedroom when Emily returned from school, and Sarah met her daughter at the door with an expression that mixed concern with forced cheerfulness. "Grandma's feeling a little under the weather today," Sarah explained, though Emily could see the worry in her mother's eyes. "She's been having some dizzy spells, and Dr. Matthews wants her to rest for a few days." Emily felt something cold settle in her stomach. Grandmother Rose had always seemed so strong, so permanent, like the oak trees that dotted their property. The idea that she might be truly ill was almost too frightening to consider. "Can I see her?" Emily asked. "Of course, sweetheart. Just keep it quiet, okay?" Emily tiptoed into her grandmother's room, where Rose lay propped against pillows that made her seem smaller and more fragile than Emily had ever seen her. But Rose's eyes were alert, and she smiled when Emily approached the bed. "Come here, little one," Rose whispered, patting the quilt beside her. "Tell me about your day." Emily climbed carefully onto the bed and snuggled against her grandmother's side, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap and the faint herbal smell that always clung to Rose's clothes from her work in the garden. The reporter came back. Emily said she wanted to put Grace on television. Rose's arm tightened around Emily protectively. "And what did you think about that?" "I didn't like it. Grace didn't like it either. It felt wrong, like they wanted to turn something special into something ordinary." "You have good instincts, Emily. Not everything that's beautiful needs to be displayed. Some gifts are meant to be treasured quietly." They lay together in comfortable silence for a while, and Emily found herself thinking about what would happen if her grandmother got sicker or worse. Rose was the one who understood about Emily's connection to animals, who encouraged her stories, and never made her feel strange for the way she seemed to communicate with creatures that others saw as simply wild. "Grandma," Emily said finally, "will you teach me everything about the family stories and the animals and why Grace chose me?" Rose was quiet for so long that Emily wondered if she had fallen asleep. But then she felt her grandmother's hand stroke her hair gently. "I'll teach you everything I can, sweet child. But some things you'll have to learn on your own, the way I did, and the way my grandmother did before me. The animals will be your teachers too." That evening, Emily discovered just how true those words would prove to be. She was sitting on the porch with a smooth river stone she had found by Miller's Creek earlier that week, a stone that seemed to warm in her palm whenever she held it, when Grace appeared at the edge of the yard. But this time, she wasn't alone. Following Grace at a respectful distance came a small parade of woodland creatures: 2 rabbits, a raccoon, a red squirrel, and a barn owl that perched on the lower branch of the apple tree. They arranged themselves in a rough semicircle, all of them focused on Emily, with the kind of attention usually reserved for important announcements. Emily stood up slowly, the warm stone still clutched in her palm, and walked toward them. As she approached, she realized she could sense something from each of them. Not specific thoughts, but emotions and intentions as clear as if they had been spoken aloud. The rabbits radiated curiosity mixed with trust. The raccoon felt playful, but respectful. The squirrel seemed almost excited, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The owl conveyed ancient wisdom and approval, but it was Grace who served as the bridge between Emily and the others, translating her human intentions into something the wild creatures could understand. Through Grace, Emily sensed that they had come not just to meet her, but to accept her, to acknowledge her as someone who could be trusted with their secrets and their safety. One by one, they approached her. The rabbits touched their noses to her outstretched fingers. The raccoon briefly placed a tiny hand-like paw in her palm. The squirrel chattered softly before scampering up her arm to perch briefly on her shoulder. Even the owl descended from its branch to regard her with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of countless nights. When they finally dispersed back into the gathering darkness, Emily remained on the porch with Grace, both of them seemingly processing what had just occurred. The stone in Emily's palm felt warmer than ever, as if it had absorbed some essential energy from the encounter. "They know about you," Emily said softly to Grace. "They've been waiting for me, haven't they?" Grace stepped closer and gently nuzzled Emily's cheek, a gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. Emily understood that her connection to the animal world was growing stronger, expanding beyond her friendship with Grace to encompass a broader community of creatures who had somehow recognized her as one of their own. Inside the house, Sarah, and Rose had witnessed the entire scene from the kitchen window. Sarah stood with her hand pressed to her mouth, struggling to process what she had seen, while Rose nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose deepest beliefs had been confirmed. "It's happening faster than I expected," Rose murmured, though whether she was pleased or concerned was difficult to tell. "What's happening, Mom?" Sarah asked, though part of her feared the answer. Rose turned from the window with eyes that seemed to hold secrets spanning generations. "Emily's coming into her inheritance, the gift that's been waiting in our family line for someone pure enough of heart to claim it." As Emily finally came inside for the night, the healing stone still warm in her pocket, and Grace, having disappeared into the woods with promises to return tomorrow, she felt as if she was standing on the threshold of something immense and wonderful, and slightly terrifying. The community of animals had accepted her, but with that acceptance came responsibilities she was only beginning to understand. The willow crown sat on her dresser, its woven branches seeming to glow faintly in the moonlight that streamed through her bedroom window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new wonders, and perhaps new tests of the unusual gift that was blossoming within her like a flower finally ready to bloom. The ancient oak tree stood at the far corner of the Parker property, its massive trunk, scarred by decades of storms and seasons, its roots extending deep into earth that had nourished it for over a century. Emily had always felt drawn to this particular tree, often spending quiet afternoons reading in its shade or simply sitting against its rough bark, feeling somehow connected to its patient endurance. But it wasn't until a month after Grace's acceptance by the woodland community that Emily discovered the tree's most remarkable secret. She had been following Grace on one of their evening walks, venturing farther from the house than usual, when Grace led her directly to the oak's base and stood waiting with that particular stillness that Emily had learned meant pay attention. Grace looked pointedly at a section of the trunk about 3 feet from the ground, where the bark formed a natural hollow just large enough for a child to reach inside. Emily approached cautiously, her fingers exploring the smooth interior of the hollow until they encountered something that made her heart race with excitement. Inside the tree's embrace, wrapped in what felt like oiled leather, was a collection of small objects that seemed to pulse with the same warm energy she had felt from her healing stone. She withdrew the bundle carefully and settled cross-legged in the grass to examine its contents. The leather wrapping was soft as velvet, darkened by age, but still supple, tied with a cord that might once have been white, but had faded to the color of old ivory. Inside, she found treasures that spoke of generations of connection between her, family, and the natural world. There was a silver whistle, tarnished but intact, that produced no sound when Emily blew into it, yet somehow made Grace's ears perk forward alertly. A small pouch contained what looked like ordinary acorns, until Emily poured them into her palm and felt them warm to her touch. Most intriguingly, there was a folded piece of paper covered with handwriting so old and faded that Emily could barely make out the words. She squinted at the writing in the fading daylight, managing to decipher fragments. The covenant between the daughters of this house and the creatures of field and forest. To protect and be protected, the old ways remembered when others forget. Emily Rose Catherine Sarah. Her own name was there, along with her mother's and grandmother's, and others that must belong to ancestors she had never known. Grace moved closer as Emily studied the paper, and through their connection, Emily sensed that the deer understood the significance of what she had found, even if Emily herself was only beginning to grasp its meaning. That evening, Emily showed her discoveries to Rose, spreading the objects carefully on the kitchen table while her grandmother examined each piece with reverence and growing wonder. "I remember my grandmother mentioning something about family treasures hidden in the old oak," Rose said softly, her weathered fingers tracing the edges of the ancient paper. "But I thought they were lost forever when the big storm of '78 damaged so many trees. What does it mean, Grandma, about the covenant?" Rose was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with memory. "It means, dear one, that what you're experiencing with Grace isn't new. It's been part of our family for longer than anyone alive can remember. Your great-great-grandmother Elena, the one I've told you stories about, she wasn't the first. This goes back generations, maybe centuries. Sarah, who had been listening from the doorway, came to join them at the table. Mom, you're talking about this like it's real, like Emily actually has some kind of supernatural connection to animals. Rose looked at her daughter with infinite patience. Sarah, you've seen what I've seen. You've watched Emily with Grace, with the other creatures that come to her. At some point, we have to stop explaining away what's right in front of us and start accepting it. As if summoned by their conversation, Grace appeared at the kitchen window, her face visible in the glow of the porch light. She stood there watching them through the glass with eyes that seemed far too knowing for a wild animal. The next few days brought changes that would test everyone's ability to accept what couldn't be easily explained. Emily discovered that her connection to the animal world was expanding in ways that both thrilled and overwhelmed her. She began to sense the approach of thunderstorms through the nervous energy of barn cats, could predict when Mr. Peterson's mare was about to foal by the restless behavior of the farm's dogs, and found herself understanding the chattering of squirrels with startling clarity. Most remarkably, she began to have vivid dreams that seemed less like sleep fantasies and more like windows into the secret lives of the creatures around Millbrook. She dreamed of the fox family that denned near Miller's Creek, seeing through their eyes as they taught their kits to hunt. She experienced the world from the perspective of the barn owl that nested in Henderson's old silo, soaring through moonlit nights on silent wings. These dreams brought more than wonder. They brought responsibility. Emily would wake knowing that the rabbit family behind Thompson's garden needed protection from a stray dog, or that the raccoon with the injured paw required help finding fresh water. Each morning brought new information and new requests for assistance that only she could provide. It was during this period of expanding awareness that Grace brought Emily the most significant news yet. They were sitting together in their favorite spot beneath the apple tree when Grace suddenly rose to her feet, her entire body radiating excitement mixed with something Emily had never sensed from her before, a deep, nurturing protectiveness. In their connection, Emily understood what Grace was trying to communicate, though the knowledge seemed impossible. Grace was going to become a mother. Really? Emily whispered, her hands reaching out to gently touch Grace's sides. Through her palms, she could sense the tiny sparks of life growing within Grace, two distinct heartbeats that pulsed with the same warm energy she had felt from the objects in the oak tree hollow. Grace lowered her head until her forehead touched Emily's, and through that contact came a flood of images and emotions that left Emily breathless. Grace trusted Emily not just as a friend, but as a guardian for her unborn fawns. She was asking Emily to be present when they were born, to help protect them in those vulnerable first days of life. "I promise," Emily said solemnly, understanding instinctively that this was a sacred trust being placed in her young hands. "I'll help you take care of them." The news of Grace's pregnancy spread through Millbrook's animal community with remarkable speed. Emily began to notice increased activity around their property, more birds perching in their trees, rabbits grazing openly in their yard, even the typically shy raccoons showing themselves in broad daylight. It was as if the woodland creatures were organizing themselves around the upcoming birth, creating a protective circle around Grace and, by extension, around Emily. But with increased animal activity came increased human attention. Harold Thompson, who had been watching Emily's interactions with growing fascination, finally worked up the courage to approach Rose about what he had been witnessing. "Mrs. Parker," he said one afternoon as Rose tended her garden, "I hope you don't mind my asking, but is that child of yours some kind of—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Some kind of animal whisperer." Rose straightened slowly, her eyes taking in Harold's expression of wonder mixed with concern. She had known this conversation would come eventually. "Harold, What exactly have you seen? I've seen that deer of hers bring other animals to meet her. I've watched wild rabbits eat from her hand, seen owls perch on her shoulder like trained birds. Yesterday, I swear I saw her having a conversation with the raccoon family that's been getting into my garbage, and after she talked to them, they stopped coming around my cans and started using the feeding station she set up behind your shed. Rose nodded thoughtfully. And what do you think about that, Harold? Harold removed his worn baseball cap and ran his fingers through his thinning hair. 20 years ago, I'd have said it was impossible. But Martha always insisted there were people who could bridge the gap between human and animal understanding. She used to talk about her great-aunt who could predict weather by watching how farm animals behaved, who could calm the most skittish horse just by speaking to it. Martha was a wise woman. Yes, she was. Harold's voice carried the weight of grief that never quite fades. She'd have loved watching Emily with that deer. Martha always said that children who were kind to animals grew up to be the kind of people who made the world better. Rose felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Harold's acceptance meant more than he could possibly know. If a practical man like him could recognize the gift Emily carried, perhaps their small community was more ready for wonder than she had dared to hope. That evening, as Emily sat on the porch with Grace and several of her animal friends arranged around them like a court gathering around a beloved queen, Rose shared Harold's visit with her granddaughter. Mr. Thompson said Martha would have loved watching me with Grace, Emily said, her voice thoughtful. Do you think she can see us from heaven? Rose considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think love doesn't end just because someone's physical presence does. Martha's love for all living creatures, that's still here, in Harold's growing acceptance of what he's witnessing, in your gift, in the way you care for Grace and all her friends. Emily nodded, understanding more than her 8 years should. Have allowed. Around them, the evening settled with the kind of peace that comes when all living things feel safe and protected. Grace dozed beside Emily's chair, while a family of rabbits grazed peacefully in the yard. A red squirrel chittered softly from the apple tree, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, an owl called its ancient blessing over all who dwelt in harmony with the natural world. The ancient oak stood sentinel at the edge of the property, its hollow now empty of its treasures, but somehow still radiating the promise of protection and continuity. Emily touched the silver whistle that now hung around, her neck beneath her clothes, feeling its smooth weight against her heart. She was beginning to understand that her gift came with a legacy of responsibility, stretching back through generations of women who had made themselves bridges between the human and animal worlds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new wonders, and perhaps new tests of her growing abilities. But tonight, surrounded by creatures who trusted her completely, Emily felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The old copper weather vane atop what remained of Millbrook's original church had been spinning unpredictably for 3 weeks, pointing in directions that seemed to have nothing to do with wind patterns and everything to do with Emily Parker's presence in town. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, was the first to notice the phenomenon when she arrived early one morning to find the weathered rooster pointing steadily southeast, directly toward the Parker house, despite a strong northwesterly breeze. She mentioned it casually to Harold Thompson when he stopped by to return a book about organic gardening, and he confirmed that he'd been watching the same thing from his kitchen window. Points right at that child whenever she's nearby, he said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to accept the impossible. Swings back to normal when she goes inside or heads off to school. The weather vane's behavior became another small piece of evidence that Emily's gift was growing stronger, affecting not just living creatures, but somehow resonating with the very elements of their environment. Rose recovered from her illness during this period, attributing her improved health to the healing energy she felt whenever Emily was near. The dizzy spells that had worried them all disappeared entirely, replaced by a vitality that made Rose seem years younger. "It's like having a piece of sunshine living in the house," Rose confided to Sarah one evening as they watched Emily conduct what had become her nightly gathering with Grace and an ever-expanding circle of woodland friends. "I can feel my strength." Returning just from being around her, Sarah, who had initially been skeptical about attributing her mother's recovery to Emily's mysterious abilities, found it increasingly difficult to deny the connection. Rose's doctor had been amazed by her rapid improvement, unable to explain the sudden return to health that defied all his expectations for a woman her age. But with Emily's growing influence came growing complications. The wildlife refugee director, Dr. Marcus Webb, arrived unannounced on a Thursday morning with credentials from the State University and a van full of scientific equipment. He introduced himself as someone interested in documenting unusual animal behavior patterns and requested permission to observe Emily's interactions with Grace. "This could be a remarkable opportunity for scientific study," Dr. Webb explained to Sarah and Rose as they sat in the living room while Emily was at school. "We have reports of unprecedented cooperation between wild animals, behavioral modifications that challenge everything we understand about interspecies communication. If your daughter really has developed some form of enhanced animal empathy, the implications for conservation efforts could be revolutionary." Rose listened with the polite attention of someone determined to be courteous while remaining unmoved. "Dr. Webb, Emily's relationship with these creatures isn't a scientific curiosity to be studied. It's a sacred trust that's been passed down through generations of our family. But surely you understand the potential benefits." "I understand," Rose interrupted gently but firmly, "that some things are too precious to be examined under microscopes. What Emily shares with Grace and the others isn't meant for laboratories or research papers." Dr. Webb's visit marked the beginning of a period when the family felt increasingly protective of their privacy. Word was spreading beyond Millbrook about the little girl who could communicate with wild animals, and each new visitor brought requests that felt more invasive than the last. A documentary filmmaker wanted to follow Emily for a week, promising to donate half the profits to wildlife conservation. A children's book publisher offered to create a series based on Emily's experiences, complete with merchandising rights and promotional tours. Each offer was politely but firmly declined, though Emily could sense the growing tension it created within her family. Sarah worried about whether they were making the right choice by keeping Emily's gift hidden from the wider world, while Rose remained adamant that premature exposure would destroy the very thing that made Emily's abilities so remarkable. It was during this period of external pressure that Grace gave birth to her twins. Emily felt the moment approaching with startling clarity, waking before dawn on a Saturday morning with absolute certainty that this would be the day. She dressed quietly and slipped out of the house without waking her mother or grandmother, following an instinct that led her deep into the woods behind their property, to a sheltered glen she had never seen before, but somehow knew was exactly where she needed to be. Grace was there waiting for her, pacing restlessly in the soft grass beside a clear spring that bubbled up from underground sources Emily hadn't known existed. The doe's sides were swollen with her pregnancy, and her eyes held a mixture of anticipation and trust that took Emily's breath away. "I'm here," Emily whispered, settling herself at a respectful distance. "I promised I'd be here." What followed was the most profound experience of Emily's young life. She remained perfectly still as Grace labored, offering only her quiet presence and the steady flow of calm support that seemed to flow between them without words. When the first fawn emerged, tiny and perfect and utterly helpless, Emily felt tears of joy streaming down her face. Grace cleaned her newborn with gentle efficiency, her maternal instincts sure and strong despite this being her first birth. The fawn was a little doe, marked with the same delicate spots that had decorated Grace's coat, though these were arranged in a pattern that seemed almost deliberately beautiful, like stars scattered across a brown sky. The second birth came an hour later, a small buck whose spots formed different constellations, whose eyes opened with unusual alertness for such a young creature. Both fawns were healthy and strong, struggling to their feet within minutes of birth and beginning to nurse, with the determination of creatures who understood their place in the world from their very first breath. As Emily watched Grace tend to her twins, she felt a shift in her own understanding of her gift. This wasn't just about being able to communicate with animals, it was about being present for the sacred moments that connected all living things, about witnessing the continuation of life and love that flowed through every generation of every species. Grace approached Emily after both fawns were settled, and through their connection, Emily felt the doe's profound gratitude and something else, a formal presentation, as if Grace were introducing Emily to her children not just as a friend, but as their appointed guardian and protector. Emily reached out carefully to touch each fawn, feeling their life force pulse against her palm, like tiny heartbeats. Through that contact came a flood of responsibility and joy that left her breathless. These weren't just Grace's children, they were, in some mystical way that transcended normal family bonds, Emily's to watch over as well. By the time Emily returned home for breakfast, the news of the birth had somehow spread throughout the animal community. Birds filled the trees around their house, singing with unusual complexity and beauty. Rabbits grazed openly in the yard, no longer concerned about human presence. Even the typically nocturnal raccoons showed themselves in broad daylight, chittering excitedly among themselves, as if celebrating the arrival of new members to their extended family. Harold Thompson, watching from his window, called Rose to share what he was witnessing. "It's like they're having a party over there," he said with wonder in his voice. "Every creature in the county seems to know something important happened." Rose smiled as she watched Emily approach the house with grass stains on her clothes and joy radiating from every inch of her small frame. "Something important did happen, Harold. Life continued the way it's supposed to, with love and protection, and community supporting it." That evening, as Emily sat on the porch surrounded by more animals than she had ever seen gathered together, she felt the weight and wonder of her expanding role as a bridge between worlds. The healing stone in her pocket seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. The silver whistle around her neck caught the last rays of sunlight, and the willow crown, which she wore only during the most special occasions, rested on her dresser. Inside, waiting for the next ceremony, she was only beginning to understand. The copper weather vane pointed steadily in her direction, spinning slowly as if blessing the entire scene, while somewhere in the hidden glen, Grace nursed her twins and prepared to bring them home to meet the human child who had promised to help protect them through all the challenges that lay ahead. Emily's gift was no longer just about communicating with individual animals. It was about becoming the center of a community that transcended species boundaries, a living symbol of the harmony that could exist when love and understanding bridged the gaps between different forms of life. The responsibilities that came with this role felt enormous for someone her age, but they also felt absolutely right, as if this was exactly what she had been born to become. The family Bible had been sitting in Rose's bedroom dresser for decades, its leather binding worn soft by generations of hands, its pages yellowed with age and marked with pressed flowers that served as bookmarks for particularly meaningful passages. Emily had seen it countless times, but had never paid it much attention, until the morning Grace brought her twins to meet the family, and the old book seemed to call out to her with an urgency she couldn't ignore. She was sitting on the porch, watching Grace's fawns take their first tentative steps into the Parker yard, under their mother's watchful eye, when she felt an almost physical pull toward her grandmother's room. The sensation was similar to what she experienced when animals needed her help, but this came from inside the house, from something that had been waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to reveal its secrets. "Grandma," Emily said, finding Rose in the kitchen preparing lunch, "may I look at the old Bible, the one in your dresser?" Rose paused in her stirring, her spoon hovering over the soup pot as she studied Emily's face. "Of course, dear one, but why now? What's calling you to it?" Emily considered the question, trying to find words for the intuition that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than thought. "I think it has something to show me about our family, about why Grace chose me." Rose set down her spoon and followed Emily to the bedroom, both of them moving with the careful quiet of people approaching something sacred. The Bible sat exactly where it always had, but as Emily reached for it, she could have sworn she felt it warm beneath her fingers. The book fell open naturally to a section near the middle, where someone long ago had pressed a cluster of violets between tissue-thin pages. But it wasn't the flowers that made Emily's breath catch. It was the handwriting that filled the margins, generations of careful notes written in different hands, different inks, telling a story that stretched back through time like a thread, connecting past to present to future. The oldest writing, so faded it was barely legible, appeared to be in a language Emily didn't recognize, though somehow she sensed it contained blessings and promises. Newer editions were in English, recording births and deaths, marriages and migrations, but also documenting something else entirely. Encounters with animals, descriptions of unusual gifts, accounts of covenant renewals that spoke of sacred responsibilities, passed from mother to daughter through bloodlines that carried more than just physical traits. Rose sat on the edge of the bed beside Emily, her weathered finger tracing the margins where her own grandmother's handwriting recorded events that had shaped their family's destiny. "Read this one," Rose said softly, pointing to an entry dated 1923, the year the farmhouse was built. "This was written by your great-great-grandmother Elena." Emily squinted at the careful script, slowly making out words that seemed to shimmer with importance. "The land chooses its guardians, as surely as guardians choose to serve. Today, I renewed the covenant my grandmother taught me, promising that our bloodline will protect the creatures who cannot speak for themselves, who trust in our gentleness, who remember our kindness across generations. The responsibility passes now to my daughter Rose, and through her to daughters yet unborn, until one comes who carries the gift in its fullness." Emily looked up at her grandmother with wide eyes. "Grandma, your name is Rose." "Yes, dear one. Name for the wild roses that bloomed the day I was born, the day my mother realized I had inherited some measure of the gift, but not its full flowering." Emily turned back to the Bible, finding entries in Rose's younger handwriting that documented her own experiences with animals, her ability to sense their needs and sometimes communicate with them, but always with the underlying note of waiting, of preparation for something greater that was yet to come. Then she found the entry that changed everything, written in Rose's hand, but dated only 8 years ago, the year of Emily's birth, were words that made Emily's heart race with recognition and understanding. Emily Rose Parker, born today, under a sky filled with birds singing in harmony. The moment she drew her first breath, every animal on the property fell silent, as if listening for something they had been waiting generations to hear. The barn cats gathered on the porch. The horses stood at attention in the pasture. Even the wild creatures emerged from the woods to witness her arrival. She is the one the covenant has been preparing for, the child who will carry the gift in its fullness and restore the ancient bond between human and animal that our modern world has nearly forgotten. Emily's hands trembled as she turned the page and found more entries, these written in different hands. Relatives she had never met, ancestors whose names appeared in the family trees that Rose sometimes showed her, but whose significance she had never understood. The covenant was first made in 1847, Rose explained quietly, when your great-great-great-grandmother Margaret saved a dying wolf pup during the harsh winter that killed so many settlers. The wolf's pack could have attacked the homestead, but instead they protected it, keeping other predators away, warning of storms and dangers. Margaret promised that her bloodline would always stand as guardians for the creatures that couldn't defend themselves against the encroachment of civilization. Emily found Margaret's original entry, written in faded brown ink, that might once have been black. I pledge that the daughters of my blood will remember what others forget, that we share this earth with beings whose hearts beat with the same hope for safety, love and belonging that fills our own. We will be their voice when they cannot speak, their protection when they are vulnerable, their bridge to understanding when fear would divide us. The weight of this legacy settled over Emily like a warm blanket that was simultaneously comforting and heavy with responsibility. She wasn't just a little girl who happened to be good with animals. She was the culmination of 6 generations of women who had prepared the way for her arrival, who had kept alive a sacred trust that connected their family to something far larger than themselves. But why Grace? Emily asked, looking up from the Bible to meet her grandmother's eyes. Why did the covenant choose a deer to be my first true connection? Rose smiled with the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from finally being able to share a secret that has been treasured for decades. Look at the very last entry, the one I made the day you freed Grace from the barbed wire. Emily turned to the final page of family records and found Rose's most recent writing. The circle completes itself today. Grace is not just any deer. She is the great-great-granddaughter of the doe that Margaret's daughter Eleanor saved from hunters in 1873. The animal bloodlines have been watching over our family, just as we have watched over theirs, waiting for the moment when the covenant could be renewed in its fullest form. Grace recognized Emily not as a stranger, but as the fulfillment of a promise made between their ancestors generations ago. The revelation hit Emily like a physical force, reshaping everything she thought she understood about her connection to Grace and the growing community of animals that had accepted her. This wasn't coincidence or even gift. It was destiny, a meeting that had been orchestrated across centuries by bloodlines that remembered love and loyalty better than most humans, remembered their own history. Grace's family has been waiting for me, Emily said slowly, the full implications beginning to dawn on her. Just as our family has been waiting for you, Rose confirmed. The barbed wire that trapped Grace wasn't just an accident, it was a test, a way for the animal guardians to confirm that you were ready to accept the responsibility that comes with the covenant. Emily thought about all the strange elements that had surrounded her first meeting with Grace. The unusual behavior, the bow of gratitude, the way the deer had looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. It hadn't been the response of a wild animal to a kind stranger. It had been the greeting between representatives of families bound together by promises older than the town of Millbrook itself. The willow crown, the healing stone, the silver whistle, all of these are tools that have been passed down through our family line, Rose continued. But they only respond to the one who carries the covenant in its fullness. You, Emily, are that one. Sarah, who had been listening from the doorway without their knowledge, stepped into the room with an expression that mixed wonder with concern. Mom, you're talking about Emily like she's some kind of chosen one from a fairy tale. I'm talking about Emily like she's exactly who she is, Rose replied with gentle firmness. The child our family has been preparing for, the one the animal guardians have been waiting for. Look at the evidence, Sarah. Look at what you've seen with your own eyes. Sarah sat on the bed beside them, reaching out to touch the Bible's worn pages. I've seen things I can't explain, she admitted quietly, but this feels so big, so overwhelming for someone her age. Emily closed the Bible carefully and looked at both women. her mother, who was struggling to accept something that challenged everything she thought she knew about the world, and her grandmother, whose relief at finally sharing the family secret was evident in every line of her face. "I don't feel overwhelmed," Emily said with surprising calm. "I feel like I finally understand why everything has felt so right. Grace didn't choose me randomly. We were already connected before we even met. All the animals that have been coming to me, they're not just drawn to some magical ability. They're part of a community that includes our family, that trusts our family because we've earned that trust over generations." She stood up and walked to the window, where she could see Grace and her twins grazing peacefully in the afternoon sunlight, while rabbits, squirrels, and various birds moved freely around them. "It's not just about being able to talk to animals," she continued, her voice carrying a maturity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her 8 years. "It's about being responsible for maintaining the connection between human and animal communities when the rest of the world seems to be forgetting that connection exists." Rose joined her at the window, placing a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "The modern world has made people believe that humans and animals are separate, that we don't need each other except for practical purposes. But the Covenant reminds us that we're all part of the same community, that we all share the same hopes for safety, love, and belonging." "And now what?" Sarah asked, coming to stand with them. "What does this mean for Emily's future, for our family?" Before Rose could answer, a commotion outside drew their attention. A large truck was pulling into their driveway, followed by several cars and a van with a satellite dish mounted on top. Men in business suits emerged from the vehicles, along with people carrying cameras and recording equipment. "Mrs. Parker?" one of the men called out, approaching the house with the kind of confident stride that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. "I'm Robert Hendricks from Midwest Development Corporation. We need to discuss the future of your property." Emily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon temperature. Through her connection to the animals in the yard, she sensed their sudden alarm and confusion. Grace lifted her head sharply, her twins pressing close to her sides, while birds took flight from nearby trees and rabbits scattered toward the safety of the underbrush. "What's this about?" Sarah called from the porch, her protective instincts flaring as she took in the array of vehicles and official-looking people. "We're here to discuss the planned development of this area," Hendricks replied, pulling out a folder thick with legal documents. "The county has approved our proposal to build a new housing subdivision, and your property falls within the designated development zone. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for immediate sale and relocation." Emily felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications hit her. The Covenant, Grace's family, the hidden glen where the twins had been born, the ancient oak with its hollow full of family treasures, all of it could be destroyed by bulldozers and construction crews who would never understand what they were demolishing. Through the window, she could see Grace watching the strange men with growing agitation, her maternal instincts clearly alarmed by the presence of these intruders who radiated no warmth or connection to the natural world around them. "This land isn't for sale," Rose said firmly, stepping onto the porch with Emily and Sarah flanking her. "It's been in our family for generations, and it will remain in our family." Hendricks smiled with the kind of condescending patience that suggested he had heard such objections before and knew how to overcome them. "Mrs. Parker, I don't think you understand. This development has already been approved by the County Planning Commission. The roads will be going through whether you cooperate or not. We're simply offering you the opportunity to profit from what's going to happen anyway." Emily felt the world shifting around her as she realized that everything she had just learned about her heritage and purpose was now under immediate threat. The covenant that had protected the bond between human and animal communities for generations could be broken not by any failure on her part, but by the simple greed of strangers who saw land only as something to be developed and profited from. If sensing her distress, animals began to emerge from the woods and fields surrounding their property. Not just the usual visitors, but creatures she had never seen before. Larger deer, a family of foxes, raccoons, possums, even a few wild turkeys. They arranged themselves throughout the yard and along the tree line, watching the developers with the kind of alert attention that suggested they understood exactly what was at stake. The battle for Emily's inheritance, and for the continuation of a covenant that spanned generations, was about to begin in earnest. The carved walking stick had been waiting in the back of Rose's closet for longer than Emily had been alive, wrapped in the same oiled leather that had protected the treasures in the oak tree hollow. Rose retrieved it the morning after the developer's first visit, unwrapping it with reverence as Emily watched from her grandmother's bedroom doorway. The staff was beautiful in a way that spoke of both artistry and power, carved from oak wood, so old it had darkened to near black, its surface smooth from decades of handling by hands that had understood its significance. Intricate patterns spiraled up its length, vines and leaves, small animals frozen in permanent dance around its circumference, and at its head the carved figure of a deer with antlers that seemed to catch and hold the morning light. "This belonged to your great-great-grandmother Elena," Rose explained, as she traced the carved patterns with her weathered finger, "and to her mother before her, and back through the generations to Margaret, who carved it herself from the oak tree under which she first made the covenant." Emily reached out tentatively to touch the staff, and the moment her fingers made contact, she felt a jolt of connection that was deeper and stronger than anything she had experienced before. The wood seemed to pulse with the accumulated wisdom and strength of every woman who had carried it, their voices whispering through the grain like wind through leaves. Through the staff, Emily could sense the presence of animal guardians throughout. The county, not just the creatures she had come to know personally, but the entire network of wildlife families that had been part of the covenant for generations. She felt their growing anxiety about the threatened development, their confusion about how to protect spaces that had been safe for so long, their trust that she would somehow find a way to preserve what had always been preserved. "They're gathering," Emily said quietly, her hand still resting on the staff. "All of them, they're coming here." Rose nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose deepest expectations were being fulfilled. The animal guardians have never abandoned their part of the covenant. When they sense that their human partner is ready to claim her full inheritance, they respond accordingly. Over the next 3 days, Millbrook witnessed something that had never been recorded in its history. Wildlife began converging on the Parker. Property from miles around, arriving in family groups and settling into territories throughout the surrounding fields and woodlands. Harold Thompson counted 14 different deer feeding openly in his pasture, while Mrs. Chen documented over 30 species of birds that had never been seen in such numbers during late summer. The animals weren't random migrants. They were organized, purposeful, each family group taking up positions that suggested they were preparing for something significant. Fox families denned along the property boundaries. Rabbit warrens appeared overnight in strategic locations. Even predator species that normally avoided each other seemed to have reached some kind of understanding, with hawks and owls perching peacefully in adjacent trees, while rodents and small mammals moved freely beneath them. Emily found herself at the center of what could only be described as a conference of species. Each morning, she would take the guardian's staff and walk among the gathered creatures, somehow understanding their concerns and strategies without need for verbal communication. They were preparing for a peaceful resistance, she realized, a demonstration of unity that would show the developers exactly what they would be destroying. But the human community was preparing as well. News of the impending development had spread through Millbrook like wildfire, dividing residents between those who welcomed the economic opportunities it might bring and those who feared the loss of their rural way of life. Mrs. Chen had spent hours in the county courthouse, researching legal precedents and environmental protection statutes. There might be ways to challenge this, she told Rose and Sarah during one of several emergency meetings held in the Parker kitchen. If we can demonstrate that the land has unique ecological significance, or if we can prove that the development would damage critical wildlife habitats. Harold Thompson had surprised everyone by becoming one of their most vocal supporters. "I've lived here 43 years, he declared at a hastily organized town meeting in the library. "I've never seen wildlife behave the way they're behaving. Now, whatever's happening on the Parker property, it's not just unusual, it's unprecedented. We'd be fools to let some corporation destroy something we don't understand." But for every supporter, there seemed to be someone else who saw only the dollar signs that development would bring. Tom Miller, who owned the hardware store, pointed out that new housing would mean new customers. Linda Peterson argued that young families needed affordable places to live. Even some of Emily's schoolmates' parents seemed to view the situation as an overreaction to what they saw as normal economic progress. The pressure was building toward a county planning commission hearing scheduled for the following Monday, where the final approval for the development would be voted on. Emily's family had been granted the right to speak in opposition, but they would have only 15 minutes to make their case against a proposal backed by significant financial resources and political influence. Emily spent the weekend in almost constant communion with the animal guardians, the staff never leaving her side as she moved among the gathered creatures. Through their connection, she began to understand the full scope of what was at stake. The Parker property wasn't just one family's land. It was the heart of a wildlife corridor that connected habitats throughout 3 counties. Destroying it wouldn't just displace the animals currently living there, it would fragment ecosystems that had been stable for centuries. Grace's twins, now strong and confident despite their young age, had become Emily's constant companions during these preparations. They seemed to understand that they represented the future that hung in the balance, the continuation of bonds that could be severed if the development proceeded. On Sunday evening, as Emily sat on the porch surrounded by more animals than most people saw in a lifetime, Sarah joined her with an expression that mixed pride with deep concern. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Sarah asked, settling into the chair beside her daughter. Emily considered the question seriously. At 8 years old, she was about to address a room full of adults who held the power to preserve or destroy everything she had learned to value. The weight of the Guardian staff rested across her lap, its carved surface warm beneath her palms, and through it she could feel the hopes and fears of countless creatures who trusted her to speak for them. "I don't know if anyone can ever be ready for something like this," Emily said, with the kind of wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her years. "But I know that I have to try. They're counting on me, Grace and her twins, all the animals who have come here, all the families that have been part of the covenant for generations." Rose appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with 3 cups of hot chocolate and wearing the same expression of quiet pride that had marked her face since the day Emily first freed Grace from the barbed wire. "Your great-great-grandmother, Elena, faced something similar when the railroad wanted to run tracks through the heart of the woodland," Rose said as she distributed the cups. She stood before the town council with nothing but her conviction and her understanding of what would be. Lost. The railroad found another route. "But that was different," Sarah protested. "This is bigger, more organized. These developers have lawyers and political connections we can't match." Emily sipped her hot chocolate and watched Grace nursing her. Twins in the gentle light that filtered through the apple tree's leaves. "We have something they don't have, though," she said quietly. "What's that, sweetheart?" Emily stood up, the staff supporting her as she looked out over the gathering of creatures that filled their property. "We have the truth, and we have each other, not just our family, but our extended family that includes every living thing that calls this place home." As if responding to her words, a great horned owl called from the oak tree, its voice carrying across the fields with a sound that seemed both mournful and hopeful. The call was answered by another owl, then another, until the evening air filled with a chorus that spoke of ancient connections and enduring loyalty. That night, Emily slept with the guardian staff beside her bed, its presence radiating the strength and wisdom of 6 generations of women who had faced their own challenges in protecting the Covenant. In her dreams, she walked through moonlit meadows, accompanied by Grace and countless other creatures, all of them moving toward a future that remained uncertain but felt full of possibility. She woke before dawn with absolute clarity about what she needed to do. The staff felt lighter in her hands as she dressed, as if it had absorbed her resolution and was now ready to lend its accumulated power to the task ahead. Today would determine whether the covenant that had sustained her family for generations would continue into the future, or whether it would end with her. But as she looked out her bedroom window at Grace and her twins, waiting patiently beneath the apple tree, Emily felt something she had never experienced before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, carrying forward something so precious that it was worth whatever sacrifice might be required to preserve it. The guardian's staff caught the first rays of sunlight streaming through her window, its carved animals seeming to come alive in the golden light. Emily smiled as she picked it up, feeling the presence of every woman who had carried it before her, knowing that she would not be facing this challenge alone. The battle for the Covenant's future was about to begin in earnest. The county courthouse buzzed with tension on the morning of the Planning Commission hearing, its halls filled with developers in expensive suits, local residents carrying homemade signs, and reporters who had caught wind of what was being described as an unusual environmental dispute. Emily walked through the crowd, holding her grandmother's hand, the guardian's staff disguised as a simple walking stick, its true power known only to those who understood what it represented. The hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the corridor outside. At the front of the room, 5 planning commissioners sat behind a long wooden table, their faces wearing the carefully neutral expressions of people who knew their decision would please some and anger others, regardless of what they chose. Robert Hendricks and his legal team occupied the front row, their presentation materials spread across multiple tables in a display of corporate efficiency. Charts showing projected tax revenues, architectural renderings of attractive suburban homes, and testimonials from residents in other communities where Midwest Development had built similar projects created an impressive argument for progress and prosperity. Emily's family had been allotted 3 seats in the 3rd row, directly behind Mrs. Chen and Harold Thompson, who had appointed themselves as unofficial coordinators for the opposition. As Emily settled into her chair, she noticed something that made her heart skip. Scattered throughout the room were people she had never seen before, all of them watching her with expressions of quiet support and recognition. "Who are they?" Emily whispered to Rose, nodding toward a middle-aged woman near the back who wore a necklace of carved wooden animals. Rose smiled with deep satisfaction. "Descendants of other Covenant families. Word travels through bloodlines that remember their responsibilities. You're not the only guardian, Emily, just the one chosen to speak for this place. At this time, the revelation that she was part of a larger network of families dedicated to protecting the natural world filled Emily with both comfort and awe. She wasn't facing this challenge alone, and the covenant she represented was far more extensive than she had ever imagined. Commissioner Patricia Walsh called the hearing to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. "We're here today to consider the final approval of the Millbrook Meadows residential development proposal. Midwest Development Corporation has presented their environmental impact studies and community benefit analysis. We'll now hear from members of the public who wish to comment on this proposal." What followed was an hour of presentations that painted dramatically different visions of Millbrook's future. Hendricks spoke with polished confidence about economic growth, job creation, and the housing needs of young families. His architect displayed renderings of tree-lined streets and parks that would preserve selected natural features while providing modern amenities for new residents. Several local business owners spoke in favor of the development, emphasizing the increased customer base and tax revenues it would generate. Their arguments were practical, focused on financial benefits that would be difficult to dispute. But then the opposition began to speak, and the tone of the hearing shifted dramatically. Mrs. Chen presented historical documents showing that the Parker property contained Native American artifacts and had been considered sacred ground by indigenous peoples for centuries. Harold Thompson described the unprecedented wildlife gathering he had witnessed, suggesting that the land served ecological functions that weren't fully understood by conventional environmental assessments. A biologist from the State University testified about the importance of wildlife corridors in maintaining regional ecosystem health. A hydrologist explained how development would affect groundwater flows that sustained wetlands throughout the county. Each expert witness added another layer to the argument that this particular piece of land was too valuable in its natural state to be sacrificed for suburban housing. But it was when Rose Parker stood to address the commission that the real power of the opposition began to emerge. She approached the podium with the dignity of someone who carried generations of wisdom, her voice clear and strong as she spoke about the deep connections between human and natural communities that modern society had forgotten. Commissioners, you're being asked to approve the destruction of something that can never be replaced, Rose said, her eyes meeting each of their faces in turn. This land doesn't just provide habitat for wildlife. It serves as a bridge between human and animal communities that has been maintained by my family for 6 generations. What you decide today will determine whether that bridge survives into the future or whether it dies with us. The room grew completely quiet as Rose continued, her words carrying the weight of lived experience and ancestral memory. I've seen this land heal wounded animals and wounded hearts. I've watched my granddaughter develop a connection to the natural world that represents everything we risk losing if we prioritize profit over preservation. Some things are worth more than money, and this is one of them. As Rose returned to her seat, Emily felt the moment approaching when she would be called to speak. The Guardian's staff seemed to pulse with energy where it rested against her leg, and through its connection she could sense the presence of animal allies gathering outside the courthouse. They couldn't enter the building, but they were there, their support flowing through the ancient wood into her young hands. Commissioner Walsh looked at her notes and called the next speaker, Emily Parker, age 8, representing the Parker family interests. The room fell silent as Emily stood up, the Guardian's staff now openly carried as she walked toward the podium. Several people gasped as they recognized the carved symbols that spiraled up its length, symbols that spoke of traditions older than the courthouse itself, of responsibilities that transcended legal documents and development proposals. Emily looked up at the 5 commissioners who would decide the fate of everything she had learned to love and protect. Behind them, tall windows showed the courthouse lawn, where she could see Grace and her twins standing at the edge of the street, as close as they dared come to the human proceedings that would determine their future. The battle for the covenants. Continuation was about to be decided by the words of one small girl who carried the hopes of countless creatures in her heart. Emily stood at the podium, feeling smaller than she ever had in her 8 years of life, yet somehow larger too, as if the Guardian staff connected her not just to her ancestors, but to every living creature that had ever trusted in human kindness. The commissioners looked down at her with expressions ranging from indulgent patience to barely concealed skepticism. After all, what could a child possibly contribute to a complex discussion about development and economics? But as Emily placed her hands on the carved staff and felt its warm pulse against her palms, something extraordinary began to happen in the courthouse. Through the tall windows came the sound of birds singing with unusual harmony and complexity, as if every species in the county had gathered to provide a soundtrack for what was about to unfold. "My name is Emily Parker," she began, her young voice clear and strong in the hushed room, "and I'm here to speak for those who can't speak for themselves." She paused, looking directly at each commissioner in turn, and when her eyes met theirs, several of them leaned forward as if drawn by some invisible force. "You've heard a lot of talk today about money and jobs and tax revenue. Those are important things, and I understand why people care about them. But there are other kinds of value that don't show up on charts or graphs, kinds of wealth that can't be counted in dollars." Robert Hendricks started to rise from his seat, probably to object that a child shouldn't be allowed to derail serious proceedings, but Commissioner Walsh gestured for him to remain seated. Something in Emily's presence commanded attention in a way that transcended her age or size. "6 months ago, I found a baby deer caught in barbed wire," Emily continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I helped her get free, and she stayed to thank me instead of running away like wild animals are supposed to do. Her name is Grace, and she's here today, just outside these windows, because she understands that what you decide will affect her family too." As if summoned by Emily's words, Grace appeared at the courthouse windows, her twins beside her, all 3 deer, visible to everyone in the packed hearing room. A murmur of amazement rippled through the crowd as people realized they were witnessing behavior that challenged everything they thought they knew about wild animals. "Grace chose to trust me because her family and my family have been taking care of each other for more than 150 years, Emily explained, her hand tightening on the staff as she felt the presence of her ancestors flowing through the carved wood. "My great-great-great-grandmother made a promise that our bloodline would protect the creatures who needed protection. Grace's great-great-great-grandmother was one of those creatures." The room had grown so quiet that Emily could hear the soft breathing of the people around her, could sense their growing understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a routine planning hearing. "Mr. Hendricks wants to build houses where Grace's family has lived for generations," Emily said, turning to look directly at the developer. "He wants to cut down the trees where owls nest and foxes den, pave over the meadows where rabbits raise their babies, drain the wetlands where frogs sing their evening songs." Hendricks found his voice at last. "Now see here, young lady, this is a legal proceeding about economic development, not a fairy tale about talking animals." But Emily wasn't finished. "I'm not telling fairy tales, sir. I'm telling you about relationships that are real and responsibilities that matter. If you destroy my family's land, you won't just be building houses. You'll be breaking promises that have been kept for 6 generations. You'll be cutting connections that can never be repaired." The Guardian's staff seemed to grow warmer in her hands as Emily spoke, and through its ancient wood she felt the presence of every woman who had carried it before her. Margaret making the first covenant with trembling hands, Elena standing before the railroad company, Rose tending wounded creatures in her kitchen. Their strength flowed into her as she faced the most important moment in the covenant's long history. "I know I'm just a kid," Emily said, her voice now carrying a weight that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her years. "And maybe you think kids don't understand important things like money and progress, but I understand something you might have forgotten. We're all connected. The animals, the trees, the water, the land, the people, we're all part of the same family." Grace pressed closer to the courthouse windows, and as she did, other animals began to emerge from the surrounding trees and lawns. Rabbits appeared on the courthouse steps. Birds perched on the windowsills. Even a family of raccoons made their way to the edge of the building, all of them watching through the glass as Emily spoke for their future. "These animals aren't just pretty things to look at," Emily continued, her young voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "They're my friends, my family, my responsibility, and I'm theirs. That's what the covenant means, that we promise to take care of each other no matter what." Commissioner Walsh leaned forward, her skepticism replaced by something that looked like wonder. "Emily, what exactly are you asking us to do?" Emily looked up at the 5 people who held the power to preserve or destroy everything she had learned to value. "I'm asking you to remember that some things are worth more than money. I'm asking you to choose connection over profit, relationships over development, love over greed." She paused, feeling the weight of the moment, the absolute certainty that this decision would shape not just her future, but the future of every creature that had trusted her to speak for them. "I'm asking you to say no to Mr. Hendricks, and yes to Grace." 6 months after the courthouse hearing that changed everything, Emily Parker stood in the center of what had become known throughout the county as the Memory Stone Circle. 12 smooth river stones, each one representing a person whose life had been touched by her story, formed a perfect circle around the spot where she had first freed Grace from the barbed wire. The old fence post still stood there too, now decorated with small offerings left by visitors, wildflower bouquets, carved wooden animals, handwritten notes of gratitude from families whose own connections to the natural world had been renewed. By witnessing Emily's courage, the Planning Commission's unanimous vote against the development had sent shockwaves through Midwest Development Corporation. But it had also opened the door for something far more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. Working with environmental groups, the county had redesigned the entire project as an eco-friendly community that preserved the woodland while providing sustainable housing for families who wanted to live in harmony with nature rather than in opposition to it. The new Millbrook community featured homes built with solar panels and rainwater collection systems, shared gardens where residents could grow their own food, and walking trails that allowed people to observe wildlife without disturbing their habitats. Robert Hendricks, whose initial resistance to the changes had gradually given way to genuine enthusiasm for the innovative approach, had become an unexpected champion of sustainable development practices that other companies were now copying throughout the region. "I learned something from an 8-year-old girl that my business school education never taught me," Hendricks had told a reporter from the regional newspaper. "Sometimes the most profitable path isn't the most valuable. 1. This community will provide homes for families while protecting ecosystems, create jobs while preserving traditions, generate revenue while building relationships that matter more than money." Emily watched from her stone circle as families moved. Through the community trails, children pointing excitedly at rabbits and squirrels, adults pausing to photograph birds they had never noticed before. The covenant that had once been maintained by a single family had expanded to encompass an entire community of people who understood that human prosperity and natural preservation could coexist beautifully. Grace's twins, now almost full-grown, grazed peacefully in the meadow beside the trail, completely comfortable with the gentle human presence that had become part of their daily environment. Grace herself had become something of a local celebrity, though Emily carefully protected her friends' privacy while allowing occasional supervised visits from school groups and nature photographers who approached the relationship with appropriate respect and reverence. The Guardian's staff had found a permanent home in Emily's bedroom, standing in a place of honor beside the window where she could see Grace and her family every morning. But Emily had also learned that the staff's power didn't depend on her constant possession of it. The connections it represented had become part of who she was, woven into her understanding of her place in the larger community of living things. Rose had recovered completely from her earlier illness, attributing her renewed vitality to the joy of seeing the covenant not just preserved, but expanded beyond anything previous generations had achieved. She spent her days teaching children in the new community about local plants and animals, sharing stories that connected them to the land they lived on, while honoring the indigenous peoples who had been the original guardians of this sacred place. Sarah had found her own role in the transformed community working with the county extension office to develop programs that helped families create wildlife-friendly gardens and understand their connection to local ecosystems. The practical skills she had always possessed now served a larger purpose, teaching people how to live sustainably while supporting the natural world around them. Harold Thompson had surprised everyone by becoming the community's unofficial historian and tour guide. His initial skepticism transformed into passionate advocacy for the kind of human-animal cooperation he witnessed daily. He had installed bird feeding stations throughout his property and kept detailed journals documenting the seasonal patterns of local wildlife, discovering a love for nature observation that had been dormant throughout his adult life. Mrs. Chen had expanded the library's programming to include regular story hours about environmental stewardship and animal friendship, using Emily's experience as inspiration for children's programs that fostered respect and understanding for all living creatures. The library had become a gathering place for families who wanted their children to grow up with the kind of connection to nature that Emily represented. But perhaps most significantly, other Covenant families had begun to emerge from generations of quiet guardianship, recognizing that the time for secrecy had passed and the time for community action had arrived. Emily discovered that she was part of a network of young people throughout the region who carried similar gifts and responsibilities, each protecting their own piece of the larger puzzle that connected human and animal communities across vast distances. On this particular morning, as Emily stood in her stone circle watching Grace teach her twins to graze in the presence of respectful human observers, she reflected on how much had changed since that evening when she had found a frightened fawn trapped in barbed wire. The simple act of freeing one animal had somehow freed an entire community from the assumption that progress required the destruction of natural relationships. Grace approached the stone circle as she did most mornings, her movements graceful and deliberate, her eyes holding the same wisdom that had first captured Emily's attention. Through their connection, Emily sensed her friend's contentment with the way their world had evolved, the safety her twins enjoyed, the expanded community of humans and animals who understood their interdependence, the continuation of bonds that had seemed threatened just months before. "Thank you," Emily whispered to Grace, though she knew the deer understood her gratitude in ways that transcended words. Grace touched her nose gently to Emily's outstretched hand, and through that contact flowed not just acknowledgement, but a deeper message that their story was far from over, that the covenant they represented was still growing and expanding, reaching out to touch lives and communities they couldn't yet imagine. A movement at the edge of the meadow caught Emily's attention. A young fox had emerged from the underbrush, followed by her kits, all of them approaching the stone circle with the kind of confident trust that indicated they had been watching the daily interactions between Emily and Grace, and had decided to introduce themselves. Emily smiled as she knelt down to welcome the Fox family, understanding that this was how the covenant would continue to grow. One relationship at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one connection that bridged the gap between different forms of life and reminded everyone involved that love and trust could overcome fear and misunderstanding. The copper weather vane on the old church spun gently in the morning breeze, no longer pointing consistently in Emily's direction because her influence had spread throughout the entire community. The healing stone in her pocket warmed against her palm as she extended her hand toward the curious fox kits. The willow crown, now carefully preserved in the family Bible alongside pressed flowers and handwritten records of the covenant's continuation, represented just the beginning of ceremonies and celebrations that would mark the expanding relationship between human and animal communities for generations to come. As Emily knelt in the memory stone circle, surrounded by creatures who trusted her completely and watched by a community that had learned to value connection over conquest, She understood that her childhood act of freeing Grace had been just the first note in a symphony of healing that would continue long after she had grown up and passed the guardian staff to the next generation. The sun climbed higher in the morning sky, warming the stones beneath her feet and illuminating the faces of children who walked the community trails with their parents, all of them learning to see the natural world not as something separate from human life, but as the foundation that made all life possible. Emily Parker, 8 years old and already a bridge between worlds, stood at the center of her stone circle and looked toward a future where the covenant between human and animal communities would never again need to hide in secret, where children would grow up knowing that kindness toward all living creatures wasn't just a virtue, but a responsibility that connected them to something far larger and more beautiful than they had ever imagined possible.